So I'm just trying to let people know, I think, through all of my stories that, yes, the world isn't a big, bad, scary place, and that wherever I go, people are people, and people are generally good and willing to help you out if you break down, if you get lost. We're all human beings, and people are generally good.
Podcast Junkies 209. Welcome back. I'm your host, Harry Duran. In case you're new to the show, this is the one where we speak to podcast guests from around the podosphere doing really interesting things in the world of podcasting. In case you missed last week's episode, it was with Eric Hunley, host of Unstructured. He's an eternal student of the interview, and we talked a lot about the interview process and how he preps for each guest. This week, I have the opportunity to speak with Scott Gurian, and he was introduced to the show by a recent guest, Stephanie Lahart. Scott is the host of the Far From Home podcast, a show where he documents his travel from far-flung parts of the world, including his race across Mongolia. Scott's a radio veteran, having had stints in various radio stations, and he's worked everywhere from New Jersey to Oklahoma and back to New Jersey again. He covered Superstorm Sandy, which I was actually a part of when I lived in New York. We talk about how he started the Far From Home podcast, about the trials and tribulations of editing footage from his trip to produce his podcast, and all the adventures he had while he was on it. Once again, we are brought to you by the Scarlett 2i2 sound card by the wonderful folks at Focusrite. Shout out to Dan Hewley. Can't say enough good things about this sound card. Super clean preamps, which provide a clean boost to your sound. So I've used it both with the Samson Q2U microphone as well as the Shure SM7B, which is a bit gain hungry and definitely requires a clean sound card. So this is the new 3G, third generation sound card, and it's guaranteed to make your audio sound completely professional. Stay tuned till the end of the episode where I reveal this week's retention hashtag, but let's get started on this adventurous conversation with Scott. So Scott Gurian, host of Far From Home, thank you for joining us on Podcast Junkies.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So we were introduced by Stephanie Lahart, and I'm wondering if you had known Stephanie prior or she was just a fan of your show.
I actually met Stephanie several years ago at the Podcast Movement Conference out in when it was in Anaheim, California, and I think we might have been. I think I attended a session that she ran, and she had some really interesting tips for people who were podcasting, and it was interesting. That was the first and since only time I had been to Podcast Movement, and I don't know, I felt like I didn't totally fit in just because the type of work that I did was very different from many of the other podcasters there. Many of them are people who have podcasts to promote their businesses, or it's more of an interview style, podcast format where it's just, two guys chatting in their garage or whatever. What I do is very different. I come kind of from a public radio background, and so I don't usually do interviews on my show. It's more kind of a highly edited and produced kind of thing, like storytelling, and I'll go out and record all this field tape on some trip I take and produce like a public radio kind of style story. And I just felt like I didn't really relate necessarily to, I picked up little bits from, the other people, and I think Stephanie was maybe just getting started listening to podcasts at that time.
Yeah.
And she hadn't heard that many different sorts of things. And so I told her about my show and she was interested and she checked it out and she kind of quickly became a really big fan, and it was not like something she had heard before. So we've, I guess, kind of kept in touch online since then.
Which Podcast Movement, what city was it in? Do you remember?
So that was in Anaheim, California.
Oh, Anaheim,
that
was a couple of years ago.
Right.
So I think since then they've actually made a concerted effort to have tracks for people that are coming from public radio.
Okay.
And there's a lot of things that are the similar in terms of we're all fans of audio, of the audio medium, but there's obviously a lot of things that are different. So can you just educate the listener a little bit on your background, education, and how you ended up in radio?
Sure. How far back do you want to go? We can start at the very beginning. I even way back like in high school, I was
Perfect.
I don't know, I was always interested in audio visual kind of stuff. I was like the president of the school TV studio, and we would do little skits and, just fun stuff. And I was interested in kind of the technical side of it as well, just how to edit, and put things together.
Was it the AV club? Because it seems to be the AV club in all.
Oh no, we
we
called it the TV studio. No, they didn't have us setting up like projectors for the teachers or boring stuff like that. No, we just got to do fun stuff.
Cool.
So that was cool. We had like a little studio with a 3-camera setup and everything.
Nice.
Old equipment that was donated from places, but it was fun. Initially, my interest was in television and video, just because there's kind of different opportunities. As much as I love radio and audio, there's certain things you could do creatively when you add the visual medium that are hard to do in audio. I constantly, even now, sometimes with my show, I'm glad, now we have the internet and the websites, and I tell people, as much as I'm trying to describe this, you really need to see it and just go to my website and check it out, or my Instagram or Facebook feed.
That makes sense.
So that was my initial love of, was TV and video. But then it was just kind of getting my foot in the door as a young kid getting started. And I just happened to know someone who worked at a community radio station in New York. And so I contacted him and said, hey, is there any way I could volunteer? And I was like a freshman in college. And he said, sure, just stop by sometime. And I got thrown in kind of totally over my head, and just it got to, the age of like 19 or whatever, just do reporting, and no one trained me. I was, I listen back now and I cringe, like it was really bad.
Do you still have access to some of those recordings?
I have, on a cassette tape somewhere. I got to dig it out, but I really don't even want to listen. I didn't know what I was doing, and I just sound really amateurish, and even my voicing and everything, just the way I would, very sing-songy, and didn't know just how to read like a normal human being talks, like they sound. It sounded like I was performing.
Well, it's interesting because it's very similar to what podcasters who are just getting started say, like they don't like the sound of their voice, and it's similar to anyone who's recording themselves for the first time. I think until you actually hear yourself, you're not aware of like your own cadence and whatever mannerisms, tics you might have, and those certainly tend to manifest themselves over time.
Well, that's part of it, but I think also because here I was in front of a microphone and I felt like I needed to perform in some way, and you do need to a certain degree, but I was overperforming. Like I think the goal should be to just sound like a normal human being talking, and not to sound like you're performing, or and then I hear people, sometimes they want to imitate their favorite radio person or podcast person, and so everyone's trying to sound like Mark Maron from WTF or something, and when he does
Terry
it,
Gross.
yeah, or Terry Gross, and when they do it, it's authentic to them because that's who they are. But if you're trying to just sound like them, but it's not really you, it comes across as kind of artificial. And so I guess it goes along with like finding your own voice and just like sounding like yourself and not trying to sound like someone else.
Totally. Yeah.
So, so definitely some cringe-worthy things if I listen back to stuff, even stuff that I did 10 years ago or so. It took a while to, finally be confident in how I sound. So I was just volunteering locally, like a community radio station, doing some reporting. And then I went up to school up in Boston, got involved with a community radio station up there, up at MIT. WMBR, they're like community radio. It's a school station, but they involve, members of the community. So it was like a weekly talk variety type of show on Friday evenings that I volunteered in, continued doing some reporting, graduated, moved back to New Jersey where I'm from, and just started doing some freelance reporting for various places. It was kind of my way, to get my foot in the door. And then I got hired at the age of, I think like 24. I was way too young and way, again, over my head. Got totally thrown in to basically, as a Pacifica Radio, to kind of single-handedly produce a daily hour-long national show. This is while the Iraq War was heating up, and so we had correspondents in Baghdad and Amman, Jordan. So I was like having to book segments and write questions, for the host, and sometimes I would have to engineer the show live on the air, and we were very short-staffed and under-budgeted, and it was total trial by fire, and I got to learn really quickly, and eventually we got a little bit more help, so it wasn't just me anymore. So yeah, I got to learn, as far as audio editing and how ISDNs work and all that technical stuff. So it was fun. It was definitely, flying by the seat of your pants every day. You'd come in and you're like, how do I find an hour worth of material by the end of the day? And it wasn't always, looking back, a lot of it wasn't very good. It wasn't good content necessarily. It was just like filling time when you have that much time. I've learned over the years that I think one of the biggest beginner mistakes is just going, way longer than you need to with something. I think everyone needs a good editor, no matter how long you've been doing this.
That's a good point. But there's something to be said about being thrown into the deep end.
Oh, right? Yeah. Oh, definitely. So and even after that, when I got hired then as a news director again, like probably way too young at this public radio station in the Oklahoma City area. And again, it was trial by fire because I'm forgetting how old I would have been at that point, but I was still fairly young, in my mid-20s. And it was a small station, and I was the news director, but I was the only reporter also. So some days I would have to put on, a suit and tie and go to record a press conference with the governor of the Capitol. And then the next day I would go, do a story on a rattlesnake festival in Southwest Oklahoma. So a little bit of everything. And you get to be really well-rounded in a situation like that. I always recommend to people, if they're looking to get involved in radio, what should I do? And I always tell them, if you're willing and able to, go to a smaller station in a smaller city, because you'll have way more opportunities to get started. You'll be able to experiment more, much more so than if I try to just start out in New York or LA or Chicago or somewhere. Yeah, I
have a friend who, growing up, got into news reporting, and it's the same thing. Like, in order to make a mark for yourself or to get the experience, you've got to go to the smaller markets, and you've got to do the stories about everyday Americana life. And I wonder if it's interesting for you, because I actually grew up on the East Coast. I grew up in Yonkers, New York, which is just north of Manhattan. I'm wondering how it was for you growing up on the East Coast and then having the ability to see what other parts of this country were like.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I'm a fairly non-judgmental person. And, everyone said, oh, wasn't it a big culture shock going from New Jersey to Oklahoma? But I feel like partially wherever you go, like, you find your people, and you find, I wasn't in the middle of nowhere. I was, in Norman, which is a college town where the University of Oklahoma is. It's like half an hour or so south of Oklahoma City. If I wanted to go to Tulsa, that was like a couple hours away. So there was stuff going on there, like an art scene. They had an annual film festival. So you meet cool people. And I don't know. I like I said, I feel like I've always been pretty non-judgmental. If I might not, agree with someone, politically or socially or culturally, I always try to, put myself in their shoes and think, well, if I had the same formative experiences that they had, maybe I'd feel the way they do, Certainly I have my opinions and I feel certain ways, but rather than being so quick to judge, I think when I first started out in radio, coming from like Pacifica Radio and that background, I guess maybe I was more of what might be called an advocacy journalist, and I had certain issues I wanted to report about or whatever. And over time, I think my interests have more been about explaining and trying to understand. And instead of trying to hit someone over the head and convince them, of a certain point, just to figure out like, well, how does that work? And if you, have that crazy point of view, well, where did that come from? And why, just to learn more about that. I'm just genuinely fascinated.
Yeah, I think it's an acquired skill, or it's an interest in learning other perspectives. And I think a lot of people don't have the ability to disagree without being disagreeable. Yeah. And I think we would be better off, as a country, if everyone just had the ability to just take a deep breath. And even when you hear something that literally flies in the face of everything you believe in, to not take it as a personal affront and just say, to your point, like, where did this person grow up? Like, what was it about this person's background and life and family that allowed them to develop these set of values that, that resulted in how they the lens with which they see the world.
Yeah, not that it necessarily excuses, their offensive point of view, but you could understand it maybe a little bit.
Yeah. After Oklahoma, where'd you end up at?
So then I was there for 4.5 years. It just seems like a long time, but so at a certain point, like you can only learn so much from your own mistakes. Like again, it was a small station. I was the news director. I was also the only reporter. And
You must have covered a lot of football then.
I didn't. Well, it was a public radio station, so we didn't.
Football's big in Oklahoma.
Yeah, it was very big. Yes, but our public radio doesn't do as much sports. So
That's
if
true,
we would
that's
do
true,
so,
yeah.
we like did some stories about behind the scenes at the football game,
Okay.
and like all the people who work to bring tens of thousands
Yeah,
of
yeah.
people together, and the ticket scalpers outside, and the people cooking the food, and so that was kind of fun. But that's public radio's way of covering sports. Um, after 4.5 years, I really needed to move on, and not that I had to get out of Oklahoma, but I felt like I did as much as I could do there. And at a certain point, I feel like, as I said before, everyone needs a good editor, and I didn't have a regular editor there. There was like the program director, but he wasn't trained in news. I did get to do a fair amount of national reporting from there for NPR, for the BBC, for different places, just because someone always is looking for a reporter in Middle America, partially as their token voice between the coasts, but also because there's always some big news going on in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Oftentimes it was severe weather, wildfires, hailstorms, all kinds of things, tornadoes, of course. So I certainly had editors when I would file national stories, but on a regular daily basis, I didn't have an editor, and I felt like I really needed that. And then also at the same time, I had a death in the family, so that made me move back to the East Coast as well. So I moved back to New Jersey again, and went back to doing some more freelance reporting for WNYC, New York and New Jersey Public Radio, which is I guess the biggest public radio station in the country, or most listeners, I believe.
Yeah.
So then I started, I was doing odds and ends, different types of reporting. And then in 2016, that fall, I remember I had a really good relationship with my editor, Nancy Solomon, and she called me one October day, I think it was a Saturday, and she said, "Hey, there's this big storm coming, and do you want to go down the Jersey Shore?" That's how we say it, down the shore in New Jersey. "And you want to, interview people who are like boarding up their windows or whatever, preparing for the storm." And so I was like, "Sure, it sounds interesting." So I, just got my gear, hopped in my car, drove down to, the New Jersey Shore, like Seabright, that area. And then they called me. I filed some stuff for them, and they said, "Well, actually, this is what turned out to be Superstorm Sandy." And they said, "Could you actually, stay down there for the night?" And I was like, sure. I don't, I hadn't planned on it. I need to find a dog walker back home. I need to, I don't have a change of clothing or whatever, but sure. Scrambled around. All the hotels were booked because everyone who lived right on the coast had moved inland, of course. Somehow managed to find a bed and breakfast down in Long Branch that was like 6 blocks from the ocean. Wow. It was open, and it was far enough away that I wasn't worried about flooding, but there were these big tall trees around it, and so I was afraid something would come crashing down overnight on the building. So I parked in as much of a clearing as I could and was kind of worried all night. And then the power went out, so it was all dark. So she gave us a discount on the hotel rate and gave us all flashlights. And I ended up being down there for several days in the midst of this crazy storm coming ashore, just driving up and down the coast, speaking to people. And it was one of the most amazing reporting experiences I've ever had. And I feel guilty saying that. But it was really cool to be thrown in the middle of something like that, where you barely even need to look for a story. I'm just driving around a corner, and I see this business owner who, the morning after, who's coming out of her business for the first time, and she's sobbing on the side of the road. And I stopped and I've got to be on the air in half an hour, and I'm looking for a story. And do you mind? I don't mean to be a vulture, but can you tell me what happened? And her whole business was flooded, and she made custom T-shirts and mugs and for people with their logos, and she poured all of her money into it. And she showed me the water line was several feet off the floor, and all her stuff was flooded. And time after time, you just be driving around, and you just walk into a business or someone's home, and just these crazy stories all around you. And I was on the air constantly from NPR, from the show The Takeaway, from various places. And it was just the thrill of it, the kind of adrenaline of being in a situation like that. And I actually forgot to mention before Sandy, I was actually a producer for a few years as well on this national public radio news talk show called The Takeaway.
Okay.
And so I had a relationship with them. So during the Sandy stuff, then I was doing a fair amount of reporting for them as well. So then after Sandy, they decided to hire me as they got some grant money from like the Dodge and the Knight Foundation to hire me for like a year-long grant-funded thing to continue covering like the long-term recovery from the storm, following like the federal aid money, doing like investigative reporting for both radio and print as well for this news website in New Jersey called New Jersey Spotlight. And so I spent a year doing that. They liked what I was doing. They found some money for a second year. And so I did that for a few years and then went off and started my podcast, what I'm doing now.
Yeah, it was interesting because I was living in Manhattan on the Lower East Side during Sandy. So I vividly remember exactly what happened. The water level on Avenue C was up to like the windows of cars. So like it was bizarre to stare outside and see Avenue C like look like a river.
Yeah, and all your power, below 14th Street, I think, went out? Was it?
Yeah, no, it was below 50.
Oh, really?
Either 78th or 57th, and
I think the transformer was on 14th or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember when it went out. I remember when it went out. It literally, you heard an explosion, and then we looked across to like the Brooklyn side, and it was just like, because the Con Ed plant was right there, and we saw the spark, and we're like, there was like, whoa, like what just happened?
The end of the world is coming, yeah.
And then, Lower East Side, a lot of high-rise walk-ups, 20, 30 floors, and so these people had to, walk up and down, and I think it was like a whole week. The first day, like no water, and then, but yeah, to your point, like just seeing, because New York City, a lot of businesses have the gates, the underneath the storage, underneath like their shops, and so literally like everything was flooded. Like we had below ground parking garages that they go 2 or 3 levels deep, right? And so all those cars were flooded, and it's seawater, right? So it's instantly it's not just fresh water, it's seawater, so it's instantly damaging the car's totaled at that point. So all the insurance companies had huge RVs there, like State Farm or whatever it was. I think Geico, where they would just have an RV parked outside. You would just be processing claims, and it was bizarre to we had a friend who lived on in Spanish Harlem, so we biked up there to take a shower, and coming back, like just riding your bicycle down, I think it was Fifth Avenue, like, and you look left and right, and all the streets are blacked out completely. So it was interesting, and then obviously there were stories in Jersey. You would see the PATH train got flooded.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
So yeah, I mean, what did you learn about, like, was it the first time that you had conversations with people who had gone through something pretty traumatic in their lives?
Maybe. It was certainly the first time I had spoken to people who had something just happen. Like I think I had spoken to people like after September 11th. I had done a whole documentary on that. I
was there as well.
Yeah. So I guess that is but that was more like talking about their family members or friends who died. Like this is like people themselves who, not to downplay that, but themselves who went through this experience of being flooded and having it's just a very different type of experience, and on such a mass level, and yeah, it was just amazing.
Did you change, or did you learn anything about how to approach a person who has just immediately gone through that sort of trauma, or even in the conversations you had post 9/11? Because I know a lot of folks who are listening have their own podcasts, like to do interviews, and some of them, I would imagine, would have guests on that are covering a sensitive topic or something they want to address that happened to the specific guest, and we're always nervous about what to say, how to say it, and whether we're going to be offending people, or whether how much we want to push, because the journalist inside of us, or the reporter or the podcast host, wants to get the good part of the story and the emotional part, but we don't want to feel like we're doing it at the expense of our guest or whoever it is we're speaking to.
Yeah, I think the key is just to be a human being more than a reporter, just to be sensitive, to tread lightly. I try to, I mean, it helps if you can spend time with people beforehand, so you're not just swooping in and like with the whole September 11th thing, I spent a week covering this walk of like September 11th families and friends who were like walking for peace from the Pentagon up to New York. And so I spent several days like following along with them. And so over time, you kind of build people's trust. They feel more comfortable around you. They could, see your motivations, and, they see that I'm
sense.
not just parachuting in to grab a soundbite, So that helps with people's comfort level. And then when I would sit with them one-on-one and get them to open up, and just try to be very sensitive to, if there's certain things they're really not comfortable talking about, I don't push it. I say that's fine if they need to stop a moment, if you're breaking down or whatever, maybe lower the microphone a little bit. Sometimes I would never normally recommend this, but sometimes, my clunky headphones might scare people, and, I might take them off, or, in certain circumstances like that, you need to make accommodations sometimes.
Yeah, yes, to your point, just look at that person as if you're speaking to your grandmother or something like that. Just kind of be considerate about that. So just thinking about the timeline, because you said as you were wrapping up your assignment at WNYC, you started looking into the podcast. When did podcast first show up on your radar?
Pretty early. I would need to look back and see. I still have some early files I downloaded on my desktop computer, but it was very early, before podcasting was really its own thing. Like originally it was just radio shows that, would release their episodes like on the internet. You could download them, or especially for people who lived outside of the area. And at this point, this is before iPhones or anything. So you'd have like a portable MP3 player, and you'd have to connect it to the computer and sync it up and transfer the files. It was so clunky back then. Yeah. So I didn't listen regularly because it was just a pain in the ass to do all that. So what year would that have been? It would have been after I don't even know. So I remember some early stuff I listened to. Then I was just telling someone the other day, one of the early programs I remember listening to was something produced out of KCRW out in Santa Monica. They had this weekly, like a radio segment. It was called The Final Curtain. And I caught it just at the very end. Unfortunately, it like ended a few weeks after I started listening, but it was really cool. It was like a radio obituary show. And so each time they would like do little profiles of several people who had died that week, not people you'd ever heard of, but people who maybe played some really interesting or important role behind the scenes, or something's named after them, or, they were the founder of some quirky technology that we use every day. Just really fascinating people who it's kind of a shame you never heard or knew anything about them until they died. But it was a really fun show, and unfortunately that ended shortly thereafter. And then I think I stopped listening to podcasts for a long time, and then just I guess the last few years I started getting back into them more and more. And now, it's so hard to keep up now. Like there's a bunch that I listen to regularly in several daily, programs from like the New York Times and the Washington Post. But, I went through my queue a few months ago, and there's like 200 shows in there. And most of them I haven't heard yet. I've, heard about and been wanting to listen to. And there's a lot of these series now, these limited run series that, come about, and it's like 12 episodes or whatever, and then it's done. But there's so much good content now. It's really hard to keep up. And for those of us who are in podcasting, it means there's more competition. They say, 700,000 shows, though I know most of them aren't produced regularly, but still. Yeah.
I was just able to binge The Habitat, which is Gimlet's news.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was about...
I haven't heard it, but I know of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I started this show because I was a fan of so many shows, and interestingly enough, the domain Podcast Junkies was available. So just because I had so many shows, but now I produce shows now, and the irony is that I get less and less opportunities to listen to shows. So I do have to listen to a couple at the 1.5x, 2x sometimes if it's just like entertainment.
Yeah,
which I know a lot of the folks from Radio cringe at. But the shows that do get produced, and you can tell that there's been time put in for like the music, and those are the ones where I'm like, okay, I just want to honor what they've put together. But sometimes the entertainment ones, I'm just like, look, like Joe Rogan, I can't listen.
If it's just people talking, and some people do talk really slow too, so I get that. I don't do it myself, but I get it. Yeah.
So when did you start thinking about the possibility of, as opposed to just looking for the next public radio gig, what was it about the idea of a podcast that interested you?
Well, the first thing was I always loved reporting internationally. And I think my first big experience was actually when I was like a junior or senior in college, and I had some friends who were filmmakers, and they were going down to Mexico. It just kind of happened to coincide with my spring break from school. And most people, you hear, oh, they're going on their spring break to Mexico, and you think going to a beach in Cancun or something. This was not Cancun.
Senor Frogs.
No. This was actually, they were following the Zapatista Indians, which was this indigenous rebel tribe. If people remember the old Rage Against the Machine videos, the people with like the balaclavas over their faces.
Oh, yeah.
And so they were joining with all these other indigenous groups around Mexico, doing this giant march for indigenous rights from Chiapas and way southeast Mexico by the Guatemalan border, marching to Mexico City, to the Zocalo, the central square, to make demands on the government. And so these filmmakers I knew were like following them, and on this like school bus with this group like for like a week or two. And one of those weeks happened to be over my spring break. So I went down and totally, I'd never done anything like this before. I don't think I'd ever traveled by myself in a foreign country. And it was the coolest thing ever. Like, it was just an amazing experience. Being kind of on my own with this group, but, reporting on my own without any friends or family, and following them around in this totally foreign culture with a different language and different foods and customs and everything. And then doing some, I was filing stories from down there. And after that, I was like, oh, wow, I want to do more of this. I want to be like a foreign correspondent or live abroad or something. So that's always kind of been in the back of my mind. And I've done a little bit more international stuff over the years. Went to Haiti a few years ago after the earthquake there. And so my initial interest was, okay, I want to continue working in radio, but do the foreign correspondent thing. And then of course, podcasts open up more opportunities. I'm not opposed. I'd certainly consider doing more radio, and that, pays the bills, and do file stories for different places. Yeah. But after I was doing the whole Sandy reporting, I really want to do more international stuff, and was starting to think about just doing radio reporting abroad. And then, so my brother and I take a big trip usually every Christmas and New Year's over the holidays. We don't have a lot of, close family in the area. We figure we might as well go somewhere, do something interesting instead of just sitting home and cooking dinner for ourselves. So we went to Thailand and Cambodia one year. We went to Ecuador and the Galapagos Islands. And one year we were in Cuba. And this would have been in 14 or 15. And we were in this tour group. We don't usually do tour groups, but in Cuba we decided we would. And we met this woman, Rosie, who was there with her husband, Alan. And Rosie's British, but she now lives in Western Australia. And our tour group had some issues. Our tour guide kind of got drunk and abandoned our group one evening. And so we all kind of bonded, as you could imagine. And we kept in touch afterwards on Facebook and everything. We still have a Facebook group we kept started and kept in touch with. And Rosie contacted my brother and me a few months later. And Rosie's, middle-aged in her 50s, but she's very adventurous. She's traveled quite a fair amount for business and everything. And she said, hey, I'm planning this big crazy trip with my best friend Jane. We're going to take part in this charity event called the Mongol Rally, and we're going to get a little tiny car and we're going to drive all the way from the UK to Mongolia. And would you and your brother like to join us? And it just sounded like an amazing experience. I had known Rosie was going to do this trip. She had mentioned it when we were in Cuba. But until she planted the idea in my mind, oh, do you want to come with us? It was suddenly it was whoa, I don't know why I hadn't considered that, but it just sounds amazing. And so how could you turn something like that down? It was months and months of planning a trip like that, as you could imagine. And it was pretty early on that I realized, hey, I should do a podcast about this. Not just to document the trip itself, but just all the preparations that go into a trip like this, getting the visas and vaccinations, planning the route. We did a whole episode on what kind of car do you buy to drive to Mongolia, and then documenting the trip itself. The trip took us about 7 weeks, 52 days. We went through 18 countries, and 11,000 miles. And then I decided, once we got to the end, I actually decided to drive all the way back on my own another friend flew out and met me just to continue gathering more stories for my podcast. Yeah. So I ended up recording I think it was 65 hours of tape. from this whole trip.
Wow.
And just fascinating, crazy stories that I then, for my first season documenting the journey there to Mongolia, I released like 24 half-hour episodes. Just really cool stuff, being able to capture, stories from these places that the average Westerner never goes to, who goes to Tajikistan, who goes to Iran as an American. Like, people are afraid of it, but it ended up being the friendliest people I've ever met in all my travels. There were some challenges recording at times because, it's unlike any recording environment I've ever been in. So I couldn't bring all my good fancy gear, my shotgun microphone and all, my big Marantz.
Probably a good thing. You probably would have gotten damaged.
Or gotten confiscated. We're going across these land borders or searching through our cars. I don't want to flag myself as a journalist in Iran or Turkmenistan or somewhere. So I had to be very discreet. I, just brought a little handheld recorder. Sometimes even that was too much. I just had to even just record on my iPhone sometimes to get like interactions with border guards, or when we got pulled over by these cops, in Tajikistan, they're trying to make us pay a bribe and we gave them some vodka. Like, I got all this on tape, it's just amazing. It was really cool to be able to tell those stories for people who are like armchair adventurous back home that, we get to live vicariously through the audio. I think that's the power of good audio, that it takes you places.
Yeah, it was interesting. I caught some of the earlier episodes, and there was one where you had to be cognizant of the fact that you were entering Muslim countries that, whether they don't eat pork, and there's no alcohol allowed. So
going into Iran, all these things in our car, like, we got to ditch them at the border. We can't bring these things with us. They'll search through our car. You'll get in trouble. Yeah.
And some of the other your other race attendees, I think, had gotten, one of the sponsors was like a beef jerky company.
Yeah, right. Yes. So
they were like,
challenges you never imagined. Right.
And then you had to. It was interesting because you're thinking about the best car for that sort of adventure, and so there was a whole episode or two about like how you're researching it. And I think the model that you ended up with it's called a Nissan. It's a
Nissan Micra. It's a little tiny. Little tiny car, like 1.2 liters, it's made for like, an old lady driving around town or something, getting her groceries, and definitely not for driving, a quarter of the way around the earth.
So was there a time when I know there were a couple of moments that you mentioned where you were worried about what was happening, the revolts that were happening in Turkey at the time, and I know there was a couple episodes where you were concerned about whether that was going to be an issue. Mm-hmm. And it actually turned out to not be. And I think in one of them you were actually surprised at how metropolitan Turkey was and how safe it felt compared to what you thought it would have been. Was there a time when you actually felt, or what was the time when you felt that you were most in danger?
I don't think I ever really felt in danger. As you mentioned, it was just bad timing in the summer of 2016 where, we ended up at the border to enter Turkey 6 days after the attempted coup. So we were really worried and scrambling at the last minute. And should we go a different way? Is it safe? But that ended up being totally fine. You never would have known anything had happened there. And people were so excited to, like, the hotel operators, restaurant owners, like, because all the other tourists have been scared away. So they were thrilled to see us. So Turkey ended up being totally fine. Iran ended up being totally fine. Like I said, friendliest people I've ever met in all my travels. Just a sense of Persian hospitality. These total strangers meet you, start talking within 5 minutes. They had never met Americans before, and they were so excited to see us. They had so many questions for us. They wanted to practice their English, and within 5 minutes, they're inviting you to their home. Come for tea, come for dinner, meet their families.
It's awesome.
It's just amazing. Destroying every.
There was the one guy who had been practicing English his whole life, and he had never met an American. And he couldn't believe we were American. He's like, "Show me your passports." Yeah. He just couldn't believe, like, Americans in Iran? Like, is that even possible? The same thing Americans would think of, can you go to Iran? So, Iran was fine. Even Tajikistan, we were driving on the Pamir Highway, which is supposedly one of, like, the worst roads in the world. And, like, several days we spent driving along the stretch, which was right across the river from Afghanistan, like, within shouting distance. It was most of the Afghan side was just sheer cliff faces. So we weren't that worried. And in between us and them, it was like these class 5 rapids in this river. So it was like, okay, I think we're safe, but I guess someone could shoot across the river or something if they wanted to. But no, that ended up being totally fine as well. No issues there. As far as, I wouldn't say in danger, but the place I felt the most uncomfortable, probably for all of us, was most likely Turkmenistan, which is, after North Korea, is like the most authoritarian country in the world. It's a very odd place. It's very hard to even get a visa to go there, and even so,
they only give you like I forget whether it was a 3-day or a 5-day transit visa. So you basically have to enter at one side, drive across in a straight line, and exit at the other side. I hear in recent years since we went, they've even started putting like GPS trackers in the cars to make sure you don't wander around. Wow. Yeah. And it's just, we constantly felt like we were being watched or followed somehow. We come across the border from Iran and drive through, it almost felt like we were going through a drive-through safari or something, this nature, like through these mountains with, like, I guess it's technically a military base. And they said, don't stop and don't take pictures, but it was just so gorgeous. Like we couldn't help ourselves. And we're seeing these packs of like gazelles or whatever they were, like running across. It was just amazing. And then we descend from the mountains from this like nature reserve military base into the city Ashgabat, which is the capital of Turkmenistan, which has, I forget what the population is, but it's a decent sized city. And the streets are totally empty. And we're like, what the hell? Like, this is so weird. It's like the city, like they had just cut the ribbon and it had just opened for business or something. And we like come to this corner and there's this like police guy there with like these like flashlights or like batons or whatever, almost like an air traffic, guy in the runway with these light up things. And he like motions to us to pull over to the side. And we're like, did we do anything wrong? But he doesn't speak any English. We don't speak any Turkmen or Russian or whatever. So we can't communicate with him, but he just holds us there a few minutes and he has a little earpiece and he's like listening to someone talking.
I remember that, yeah.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden, like, traffic starts coming from other directions, and it felt like we were in the Truman Show or something. Like, it's like the actor is walking on stage late for the performance. Like, it was like, so creepy.
Cue the traffic.
It was so creepy. And one of the other groups from the Mongol rally actually found what appeared to be like a listening device in their hotel room chandelier. Like, it was just so creepy. It was a very strange place.
Yeah, I think what a lot of people don't know about Iran specifically, I remember seeing stories about like in the 70s, it was like a metropolitan city, and there was like discotheques and people going out and listening and dancing to music, and
Afghanistan as well, apparently. Yeah.
How much did the trip help you like increase your knowledge of like the geography of that whole region?
Definitely. I mean, before I went, I think like most people, like this whole part of Central Asia was like a black hole in my geographic knowledge. All the stands, I had no idea what country was next to which, and it's still hard to figure out because they all kind of, the borders like snake together, and it's really confusing at certain places. And then there's all these enclaves and exclaves and little like disputed territories that, when you're driving and, planning out your route, you're like, okay, there's like one country, but then there's like a little island of another country in the middle of it, but you got to go around because I don't want to have to go through 2 more border crossings, which will take another few hours. So it's very confusing, but it's a fascinating part of the world. I mean, these are all former Soviet republics, so a lot of them, in addition to their own languages, they speak Russian as well. So it probably would have helped to have spoken some Russian, which we don't speak any. But it was a really interesting part of the world, the old Silk Road. Yeah.
Given the number of stands you went to, that colored your choice in the name of your team, right?
Yes, we called our team Don't Understand. That was a little pun there. So yeah,
that was fun. So talk to me a little bit about now with how do you approach 65 hours of a tape, and how do you like then decide like to put that in a way that's keeps it entertaining and not overwhelming for you, and how much time does that take for you to do that once you get home?
It was definitely daunting, and then confusing because I had audio recorded in several different places. I had 2 different handheld Tascam recorders, so that the numbering system, the files was different on each of them, and then I was recording some stuff on my iPhone, and so that was a whole. And then I had to put them chronologically in order to try to remember what went where. I tried to take really good notes on the trip. That was something I learned when I studied radio documentary years ago, and they said take really good field notes, like at your, jot down your initial impressions of a place, because once you have those initial impressions, they'll fade and you'll never have them again.
That's a good point.
So it was a combination of just in my iPhone and the Notes app, like writing down, everything, just like verbal diarrhea, just getting it all down, like, everything, or at the end of a long day, all this crazy stuff happened, and just, while it's still in your mind before you forget, like sometimes sometimes we would go through all these crazy experiences and you're like, wow, all that happened in the last 24 hours. Like, it's just amazing. We'd keep breaking down or getting rescued or towed to the next town. It's just crazy. And so it was a combination of, putting it all on my phone, but sometimes I would just narrate and record myself saying, hey, this is where we are. This is what just happened.
Yeah.
Which sometimes is
it similar to what like you would do in a movie? You'd have like the marker. It'd be like, scene 2, take 2,
sometimes
stamp.
Here now, this is sound of outside in the market. Here's a minute of just the sound of the market to mix under me when I'm editing. And sometimes that stuff I record is just for my own purposes when I'm editing to other times it's like what they call a stand-up, like it's something I plan on using, like here I am at the corner of whatever, and like all around me this is happening, and just to set a scene and like put someone in a place.
It's something that you're always conscious of, right? The fact that you are the eyes of the listener, right?
Yes, yeah, because people can't see where you are, and you need to do that for them. So I try to be as visual as possible. They talk about radio or podcasting being a visual medium, which sounds weird, but in some ways it really is. It's way more intimate than television or video, where you're just kind of giving someone the images, and it's kind of like cheating, again, there's something to be said for that. But when you're just describing things and people see them in their mind, like, it's very personal, it might not be exactly accurate because everyone's going to have their own image, but it's their own thoughts and their own imagination.
And that's the beauty of it. I think I've heard it described as the theater of the mind.
Yes.
And in the same way you read a book and you sort of like visualize what the story is like and what the characters look like in your own mind, in the same way with these types of stories, as you're hearing it described, if you had people paint or color, or if they could, what your stories were, you asked 5 different people, they'd probably paint or draw 5 different things. Based on what they heard from you.
Right. And I try to, I still try to be as vivid as I can in my descriptions. And there have been times where I've described things and then I put a picture online and someone was like, oh, that's exactly the way I imagined it, but that doesn't always happen. So basically back to your question. So I had all this audio and just tried to, at least initially, put it kind of chronological and, look back at my notes, look back at kind of the map of our route to kind of just get everything straight, because a lot of this I wasn't producing till months after I returned, so just trying to remember it all. And I think I have a fairly good memory, but I still sometimes needed some of this stuff to jog my memory. we took tons of photographs. My brother's a professional photographer, but then we also took photos with our iPhones, and sometimes the photos would just, it would help me describe things just by looking at the photo, but it would also help me remember where did that event take place, and I could look at the geotags from where the images were taken on my phone. I have this great little program on my computer where it just shows me exactly where the photo was taken and even which direction I was pointing the phone in. Wow. It's really cool. It's super cool. So the most obscure things, my brother was like, where did that happen again? And I could just pull up the photo and I see exactly where it was. So that was neat. So just sorting through it all. And it wasn't always chronological. Like, there were times where I'd move things a little bit out of the chronology just because the story worked better a certain way. But then, so after my first few episodes of that first season telling, how the whole trip came about and all the preparations, then it was more or less following us chronologically through the different countries on the trip. And some countries like Iran, I did 2 episodes from Iran because it was a really fascinating place. There was a lot that went on. Other places like Kyrgyzstan, we just kind of breezed through. We got horribly lost one day and made the mistake of following Google Maps instead of our paper maps. It went on this 12-hour detour out of the way, and then we were way too far before we realized it. But there wasn't that much that happened in Kyrgyzstan. Basically, we got lost and then we went out. So there's not even a full episode of Kyrgyzstan. So it all depended on what was, the most interesting stories.
Did you have in mind that you wanted to publish a set number of episodes?
I had no idea, and I didn't think it would be this many at all. I listened back to my initial trailer for the season, which at that point I think I said, and listen to the next 7 or 8 episodes or so. I forget what it was. I had to go back and change it recently because now that the season's done, it's like, no, it's like 24. So it just, I had no idea at all. and I tried to still be, people say 24 episodes, that's a lot. I mean, I still tried to be a disciplined editor of myself, and pretty much everything I released, even though I don't have a proper editor now, I tried to let some other people listen to it. Both my brother, because he was on the trip, and there was sometimes he would say, oh, but that other thing happened, maybe you should explain that. And even just my housemates, just to get a second or third set of ears before I release anything. And oftentimes, even though I've been doing audio and radio, for so many years, there are little things they point out that I didn't even notice. It should be obvious, but you get kind of in this tunnel vision. You're so attached to your audio, or it's things are obvious to you, but someone else hearing something for the first time, and they ask, well, what about that? And I'm like, oh, duh. Like, how did I not mention that? So again, I think editing is super important. And even though it sounds like a lot, 24 half-hour episodes, 12 hours of audio from this trip, I tried to make every moment count,
What was the response when you started releasing it?
It was slow at first because it's taken a while for the podcast to really kind of catch on. And, at the beginning, it was just a few hundred of, family and friends, people I knew or other people who went on the Mongol rally who, I tell them, listen, and, either remember your experiences or you're planning on doing this event next year, and maybe you could get some tips or whatever, get some insight into what the journey is like. So it's taken a while for it to finally, start to grow and get more of an audience. And also I was, releasing episodes kind of sporadically, not on a regular basis. And now I'm trying to, now I'm doing it on a more regular basis now that I'm on my second season. But I'm glad now that whole first season is out there. So there's a lot of people now who are discovering my show for the first time, who are going back and binging, to the whole first season. And they're really excited about it, just to follow my whole journey. And people who've told me just like over the course of a weekend or whatever, I listened to all 12 hours of your first season. It just warms my heart. Like I love hearing that kind of thing, because that's why I made it.
Every podcaster loves to hear that someone appreciates their content so much that they actually go back and listen to like past episodes. So anytime someone has said that to me with some of my content, I've gone back and listened to all your episodes. I'm like, well, I'm grateful that you have that much time.
Yeah, right.
And hopefully you learned something. So did you always have in mind that you were going to be doing a second season?
I think as time went on, I don't know that I did necessarily from the very beginning, but as time went on, I thought, okay, so what comes after this? Like once, I finished telling this journey, I want to continue doing more international reporting. And yes, I'm always constantly looking for like other radio shows or other places to have pieces on, just to get more exposure and also to pay the bills. But having my own podcast gives me a regular platform as well to a place to have these stories run and to build an audience. And I just want to keep traveling and keep creating stories from far-flung places of the world. So I'm just excited of the opportunities. I have such a long list of story ideas and places I want to go.
That's good. What have you learned about the world of podcasting that's different than the world of radio that you had grown up in and had spent the majority of your career in?
It's a lot different. It's like producing a story for a podcast is way different than producing a story for the radio. I was actually, my old boss, my old editor, called me back a few years ago to do a story for, I guess it was the 5-year anniversary of Superstorm Sandy, because that had been my beat. And they called me back and said, hey, could you do a follow-up story? Yeah. And I hadn't done a radio story in quite a while. And I was amazed by, because a typical radio story, I don't know, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 6, something like that. And that's public radio. That's a long time. You talk about commercial radio, you're down to like 45 seconds or something, you know. But even in public radio, which, gives people more space to breathe and, gives you a little bit more time to tell a fuller story. Even so, I had like some clips of tape of people I interviewed and I don't know, like a 30-second clip of tape, and my editor's like, that's way too long. Like that's not, you need to get it down to 20 seconds. Like it's people don't have the attention span or just the pacing of a radio story. It's constantly like accent tracks, like, they call it actualities and my voice tracks, like constantly going back and forth. And it's you need to be really disciplined, and just the pacing of it, like it's really hard. And I really like how with my podcast I can again, I don't want to make things boring. I still want to make them interesting. I want to make every bit of tape count, but I have some more space to kind of go on. If someone's really an interesting talker, to let them go on a minute or a couple minutes, whatever, to, and then unscore it, put some music and everything, kind of a This American Life sort of style, it just gives me a lot more opportunities, and it's way more flexible and way more ways to be creative than a typical radio story.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I've heard Joe Rogan describe it as like you're the station owner, you're the marketing manager, you're the producer, you're the editor. I mean, and in some ways, you basically have all the roles, and you can control it. There's no one really censoring you in terms of like the duration of what you can and can't put out. So I've always found that fascinating.
But your listeners will let you know if it's boring, if it's true, I mean, I'm not necessarily immediately accountable to someone, but in the end you are. And so you learn over time to kind of be a good editor of yourself. But again, I think if you could find other people around you whose opinion you trust to also help kind of serve that editorial role, that helps as well. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I appreciate that you've taken the time to put this series together. I'm really glad that I found it, and it's helpful for the listener as well, because there's a lot of folks starting podcasting who don't have the radio background. So I think all the experience that you bring, and even the things we talked about, and even just by listening to your show and to your series, I think they'll learn a lot about what it takes to produce content. And so I appreciate and thank you for introducing that. I know there's a lot of podcasts out there, but there's always nice to hear quality shows being recorded by people who understand and respect the medium.
Yeah, I thank you so much. Those are, I feel like, the best podcasts, or at least my favorite ones, are people who kind of have a radio background, who know how to really tell a story, get good audio, because I think good audio is important. Like, you can have the most interesting content in the world, but if it's recorded poorly, I just can't listen. So
the attention span is so short nowadays. I tell people, like, within the first 30 seconds of hearing a podcast, you'll know, like, are they taking it seriously or not? So I think it's crucial to record that quality.
Yeah.
A couple of questions as we wrap up that I ask every guest. What's something you've changed your mind about recently?
Something I've changed my mind about. I think that I used to feel like I could travel anywhere in the world and just find interesting stories and meet fascinating people. And I still do feel like that's possible, but it's definitely way harder in certain parts of the world than others. And I wasn't initially aware of that. After we finished this whole trip with the Mongol Rally, I decided, to drive all the way back to the UK to get more stories. And so a friend flew out to meet me, and we figured, okay, we drove the southern route. Let's go back the northern way, just across all of Russia and Siberia. And I don't know what I was expecting. I guess I'm too optimistic, but I was like, Russia is not the most interesting place in the world in my experience. There are pockets of interesting places. Like we went down the Tuva, and I took Tuvan throat singing lessons, and that was, so I did a whole episode on that in my second season, and that was really cool because it's not what you think of as Russian. Like their own language, their own culture. The Tuvans are almost like Mongolian, and they have their own instruments and music. So that was really cool. But most of Russia, the people, at least initially, struck me as not so friendly, not so curious. And people have told me since that, Russians, once they get a chance to know you, they'll be really friendly and everything. But it's just that initial kind of front that, and not speaking the language and knowing the culture certainly didn't help either. But then you go to other places like in Iran, like in Cuba, where people are just coming up to you on the street, and they're so curious and they want to engage in conversation. And it's so much easier to find stories in a place like that. So, I've realized that, definitely some places in the world are harder than others. And also that, to really get the kind of stories that I'm looking for, even in the best case scenarios, I can't just parachute in. Like, I really need to spend time in a place. Like a week isn't enough. Like, ideally 2 to 3 weeks to really get to know a place well.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then lastly, what's the most misunderstood thing about you?
The most misunderstood thing about me? I think some people, when I tell them about my show and what I'm trying to do, they might not understand, like, there's several different elements I'm working in my head of kind of what I'm trying to do with my podcast. And some of it is, just that the world is, people say it's a small world, but the world is actually really, there's giant parts of the world that most people never go, and billions of stories they've never heard. So that's part of it, but also that I'm always looking for ways to kind of venture a little bit outside of my comfort zone and, have these experiences. And, so I'm the one creating the show. So it's like through my eyes and through, but on the other hand, I think people might be confused and they think, oh, it's just all about Scott's wacky adventures or something, and I don't want to make it that either. There's a little bit of an element of that, the kind of gonzo journalism, whatever. And I've done some crazy, I drove to Mongolia, and then people were like, well, how are you ever going to top that? And so then I did an episode, I went to Chernobyl, and then people were like, how are you going to top that? And then I went to Peru, and I went to this ayahuasca ceremony where people drink this hallucinogenic potion.
That's in the queue.
Yeah. So there are definitely things I do kind of in the name of journalism that I would never do in my ordinary life. But I think the goal it's not like, a radio version of the TV show Jackass, where I'm just trying to do stupid shit to, that's not what my aim is. It's more just to kind of be able to have these experiences, like go to these places to get to describe them to other people. And I think there's something special about experiencing something for the first time, or going outside of my comfort zone, doing something I normally wouldn't do. There's something very authentic about it, like in the telling of the story. Because I think the irony is that even though I have like a travel adventure show, in some ways I'm not that adventurous of a person. At least in the past, I love traveling and experiencing different cultures, but I would, methodically like plan out everything ahead of time, and I would know my route, and I would know the restaurants I would go to, and I would know all of that. And so I feel like when I'm traveling now, I'm constantly trying to strike a balance between, yes, I feel like some of that I want to do because there's always this, fear of missing out. Like, you go to this amazing place, and if you don't do any research, get any guidebooks or anything, and then you get all the way home, and then you realize, oh, I could have just driven 5 miles down the road, and I would have seen that amazing thing, So I want to kind of have the broad kind of outline ahead of time and kind of know what to expect. But I also don't think I should plan out every day and every hour. I want to leave some time to just explore and, do things that I've never done before and go to places I've never been before, to, again, not to kind of have, Scott's wacky adventures and make the show all about me, but more just kind of to both experience things for the first time myself, but then also expose other people to these experiences for the first time and have them hear my wonder and my excitement.
Well, I think that's definitely what you've done with the podcast, and you've probably helped people live a bit vicariously through you as well. People who may not have the courage or the sense of adventure to actually try something like this on their own. So that's my goal. To expose people to these things and to change their perceptions, to let people know that the world isn't necessarily a big, bad, scary place. That wherever you go, you hear stereotypes of these people in this country or this part of the world are dangerous or whatever, But then when you actually go there, time after time, I've found that things are not at all the way you had perceived that they would be once like your feet are actually on the ground. It's oftentimes very different than you thought it would be from thousands of miles away on the other side of the planet. So I'm just trying to let people know, I think, through all of my stories that, yes, the world isn't a big, bad, scary place, and that wherever I go, people are people, and people are generally good and willing to help you out if you break down, if you get lost. We're all human beings, and people are generally good. Yeah, and I think in this day and age, that's definitely a message that resonates and something that we need to hear more of. So I appreciate you coming on the podcast, sharing your story, and appreciate the work you've put into this. And I think new listeners are going to really enjoy it. So I encourage folks to subscribe to the podcast.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
What's the best place for folks to listen to the show and to engage with you online?
So the show again is called Far From Home. They could find it wherever they find podcasts, any of the podcast apps or Spotify. It's now on Pandora, any of those places. And they could check out my website, farfromhomepodcast.org, look up the show on Instagram or Facebook, or they could follow me personally, Scott Gurian, on Twitter.
Well, thanks again for your time, Scott. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So thanks to Scott for coming on the show and sharing his journey, his fantastic trip to Mongolia in this race that just sounds like it was an incredible adventure. And it's fun to hear things that some of us may never get to experience, like traveling through all those different countries. So I'm appreciative to Stephanie Lahart for making the connection and for Scott for sharing his story. That was fantastic. This episode is also brought to you by Fullcast, fullcast.co, our production company for full-service, done-for-you podcast production. We handle everything from the launch to the production and the marketing of your show. Reach out at fullcast.co for a free consult. Intro and outro music composed by Cedar and Soil. Don't forget to check out the wonderful line of sound cards by the Focusrite team, specifically the Scarlett 2i2. Tune in next week for my conversation with Amira Valiani. She's the CEO and co-founder of Glow.fm. It's a Patreon alternative that I've been digging into a lot over the past few weeks and months. She's really done something very fascinating with the tech to make it really easy for you to solicit support for your podcast, and keeping the user experience very friendly. You never have to leave the app, and you can also have private content as well using her service. It's a really interesting discussion. I can't wait for you to hear that. If you made it this far, no doubt you're listening for the retention hashtag. Let's go with Far From Scott, and you can tag myself at podcast_junkies and Scott at Scott Gurian, SCOTTGURIN. Thanks for all you do to support the show. And my ask for this week is, if you haven't already, head on over to podchaser.com and leave a review for this episode or for the Podcast Junkies show. Have a great week.